Hi everyone, hope you're doing well today. So last time we talked about arguments from analogy, and all of that was mainly sort of setup for trying to present and evaluate Paley's argument for God's existence. So in this presentation, we'll briefly review what arguments from analogy are. Then we'll introduce the teleological and design argument and break it down into an analogical premise, talk about teleological systems, and talk about the relevance of Paley's analogy. And then we'll talk about objections that come in the form of counter-analogies and potential unintended implications, and then talk about Darwinian evolution just a little bit. All right, so William Paley is well known for his development of what's been called the teleological or design argument for God. So teleology has to do with the goals or purposes of things. And so this is an argument that's going to appeal to certain goals or purposes of things we see in the universe. So one method for reconstructing this argument is to view it as an argument from analogy. This is not the only way to reconstruct Paley's argument, and it's not even necessarily the strongest way to reconstruct Paley's argument. However, I do it this way for pedagogical reasons because it gives us an example of an argument from analogy and gives us some practice in engaging with this, since these arguments are so prevalent throughout our lives. So an argument from analogy has the following form that we've discussed. It starts out by saying A is similar to B in various respects. Well, B has some feature. Thus, probably A also has that feature as well. So an example that we gave, Sam's car is similar to Colin's. Colin's car has been reliable. Thus, probably Sam's car will be reliable as well. So remember, these are inductive arguments. The premises, the analogy, is never meant to guarantee the conclusion, but it's meant to give us some observations of the world that we can appeal to provide evidence that makes the conclusion more likely, even if it doesn't guarantee. And thereby still, yet again, even if your conclusion isn't guaranteed, if you can make the conclusion likely to be true, well, the rational bet is on what's likely to be true rather than what's not likely to be true. All right, so this brings us to Paley's argument. How does he use an argument from analogy to try to argue for God? Well, the idea is natural parts of the universe, things that occur without human intervention, are like machines. So there's the analogy. Then he says, but look, machines, we know where machines came from. Machines came from an intelligent designer. So notice there's two observations that we can make of the world. We can make an observation of how these natural parts of the universe are similar to machines. And then we can make the observation that machines were caused by an intelligent designer. And it is therefore we come to the conclusion that these natural parts of the universe probably have a similar cause, and they were also probably created by an intelligent designer. All right. Even though, yet again, we haven't observed where these things came from, but we have observations to support our conclusion. All right, so there's an analogical premise at the beginning. Natural parts of the universe are like machines. Well, let's make sure we understand this premise. What examples does Paley have in mind when he talks about natural parts of the universe? Well, he means things like the human eye, the heart, a plant cell, etc. These are all natural parts of the universe. These are things that occur in the world in nature without humans creating them. All right, now, what examples does Paley have in mind for machines in this analogy? Well, these are human inventions. So during his time, he relied a lot on the example of a watch. Well, we might also today talk about a car or a smartphone. So these are the kinds of things he means by a machine, a sort of human invention here. So one worry that David Hume famously raised for this sort of argument was that there seemed to be a lot of differences between the universe and a machine. In fact, he thought there were so many differences that we just can't rely on a comparison between our universe and a machine to support the claim that they would have a similar cause. That if one is created by an intelligent designer, that the other one would be as well. And he pointed out that, look, the universe contains a lot of living things, but machines are not living. The universe is largely self-sustaining, So to keep all the planets in orbit, we don't need to sort of fix the planets in any sort of way. We don't need to be adding any energy or fuel to the universe to keep it sort of going. But with respect to machines, well, look, my car's not going to run all by itself. It's not self-sustaining. It needs me to keep putting gas in it to get energy. It needs to keep me adding oil. So it needs that sort of outside intervention to keep sort of things running. But the universe doesn't need that sort of outside energy being put in. I mean, we have the law of conservation of energy. So Paley's specific version of the design argument is structured to get around this because, for one, he's not comparing the universe as a whole to a machine. He's comparing certain parts of the universe, like the human eye or the heart, to machines. And moreover, he wants to say that there's a specific similarity between these two things that supports the argument. So he thinks parts of nature are similar to machines in a very specific, important way. Both these natural parts of the universe and machines are teleological systems. So this is a system of interconnected parts that are arranged in just the right way to perform a specific function. So let's consider some examples to make this analogy more explicit. Let's start with the sort of one that we can all observe, the machines. So a watch, let's take that machine. It's a teleological system. Its parts include the hands, gears, and battery. Now, all those parts are interconnected to one another. So as an example, all the gears are placed in a very specific arrangement so that when one gear turns, it latches onto the sort of notches on the other gear and thereby turns the other gear as well. So those parts work together to enable the watch to fulfill the function of telling time. And if the parts were not in exactly the right arrangement, then the watch would fail to tell time properly. So for instance, if the hands on the watch were not connected to the gears, well then the gears would turn, but the hands would not. And so it wouldn't actually keep track of time. Now go to the human eye. It too is a teleological system. It has parts, including the lens, retina, iris, rods, cones, etc. And all those parts are interconnected. For example, the optic nerve is connected to the eye so as to allow signals to be sent from the eye to the brain. And these parts work together to enable the eye to fulfill the function of sight. And if the parts were not in the right arrangement, then the eye would not be able to see. So notice, when I'm explaining how a specific example counts as a teleological system, I give examples of its parts, I identify the function of that thing, and then I explain how the parts are arranged in a specific way so as to achieve that purpose or function. All right, so then that brings us to premise 2 then. We've seen the comparison. We've seen the analogy between the parts of the universe and machines. Now, the idea is we've also observed that machines have been created by an intelligent designer. We know where machines came from. We know what caused them to exist. So when we evaluate an argument from analogy, we need to consider the relevance between the observed similarities and the inferred similarity. So here the question is whether being a teleological system, so what we've observed in the first premise, is relevant, is connected to how something is created. And when we look at the example of machines, that might suggest that the analogy is relevant to whether something is produced by intelligent design or not. So the fact that machines are teleological systems and the fact that they have intelligent designers are not just random arbitrary facts about machines. There's a connection between the fact that they have intelligent designers and the fact that they're teleological systems. The fact that they have an intelligent designer explains why they have the function they do and how all their parts became arranged in the way necessary for it to function. So take a watch. The reason a watch has the function of telling time is because the person who made the watch wanted to be able to tell time. They had a desire in their mind. They were able to think about that purpose. And they had knowledge about how the world works and how they could put parts together so as to achieve that function. And then they use their power and their knowledge to get those parts and put them in exactly the right arrangement to achieve that function. So the fact that there's a person with a desire to tell time and knowledge about how gears work and the ability to get those pieces and put them together, the fact that there is that intelligent person explains why the watch has its function and why all its parts are in exactly the right spot in order to fulfill that function. Thus, the example of machine supports the idea that there might be a similar explanation for how the human eye got its parts arranged in exactly the right way to allow sight. All right, so we've motivated the argument. Now we need to consider some possible problems. Well, here's one problem. There are teleological systems in nature that seem to come from natural principles operating on unintelligent matter. So David Hume gives the example of an oak tree coming from natural principles operating on an acorn, unintelligent matter. So the idea is, look, we can make a counter analogy. Instead of comparing the human eye to a watch, we could compare the human eye to an oak tree. Both of them are sort of teleological systems. They have parts that are arranged in exactly the right way so as to fulfill certain functions. But we know where an oak tree comes from. We know what created the oak tree. It came from an acorn. And there's so the acorn is not intelligent. It doesn't have any desires, doesn't have any knowledge, but there's purely natural principles that take the matter of the acorn and rearrange it by these purely natural causes into an oak tree. So maybe there are some natural principles that took the material and created the human eye in a similar way. So Paley replies, though, to this objection by saying, look, we don't know of any mechanisms by which natural principles could design a teleological system like the eye, at least during his time. So he says, look, we know how intelligence can produce teleological systems, but we don't have any explanation for what the natural principles might look like that would produce sort of a teleological system like the eye. Now, Paley also replies by saying that this doesn't weaken his argument, since the acorn's ability to grow into an oak tree shows incredible design itself. And so now we need to explain where the acorn got its incredible design from. And here he gives an analogy of, look, imagine you find a watch. You'd wonder, well, how did all those parts get arranged so as to tell time? Well, let's imagine that you see a watch make another watch. That wouldn't explain to you where the design came from. The idea is, because that would just sort of increase. You'd say, oh my gosh, this watch is so amazing that it not only can tell time, but it can create other watches. He says that would make you sort of think, well, who in the hell made that amazing watch that can make other watches? It wouldn't just sort of say, oh, I guess we're good. It happens purely naturally in the world. And so that's his response to this objection. Here's another objection, though. Look, even if there is a designer, what reason is there to think that the designer is a traditional God? If we take the analogy with machines seriously, then the analogy seems to have unintended implications about the kind of designer that would exist. Because notice, if we say, hey, look, natural parts of the universe, like the human eye, is similar to a machine, there's an analogy there. And so, since they're so similar in that they're teleological systems, well, they probably have similar causes, and we know that the machine is caused by an intelligent designer. Well, we know other things about how machines were designed as well. Machines often have multiple designers. So, who designed the iPhone? You might be thinking, well, it was Steve Jobs. Well, not really. Steve Jobs was a part of the design, but there was an entire team of designers. He had engineers helping him design every sort of part of it, working together. It was a team effort. As much as people want to sort of say it was just sort of Steve Jobs, no. So similarly, look, most of the machines we have throughout sort of human history that were created by multiple designers and not just one. And so if we want to say, hey, look, we're going to rely on an analogy between sort of parts of the universe and machines to support claims about how these parts of the universe were caused, that would seem to support polytheism, the idea that there's also similarly multiple sort of designers that caused these teleological systems in nature. But William Paley was specifically trying to support monotheism, that sort of traditional theism belief. All right, so another worry here is many machines have mistakes and break down because their designers are fallible. So yet again, let's go back to my sort of iPhone. Like every week I get a notification saying, download this update. Why do I have to download that update? Well, it's because certain things in my phone are not working correctly. They're not fulfilling its function as well as it could. My phone is imperfect, and I download this update to my phone so as to make my phone work better, to make it slightly less imperfect. But where did those imperfections come from? Why does my phone have imperfections? Well, the explanation is because the people who created my phone are imperfect. And so if an imperfect design, like imperfections in a phone come from the imperfections in the designers. If the people making my phone knew everything and they knew how to do anything, then my phone wouldn't have these problems. But natural parts of the universe also break down. I mean, sometimes people's eyes don't see. People are blind. And sometimes they are imperfectly adapted to their environments. So one of the examples I like to give is an example of the flatfish. So the flatfish is a fish that sort of swims flat rather than sort of side to side. And it has two eyes on the top, on sort of one side, so it can sort of look up. But that's not how the flatfish starts. The flatfish starts like a normal fish with an eye on each side. But then slowly over time, it deforms its skull and one of the eyes migrates over to the other side so it can see above it better. But that doesn't seem like the best design that you could have. That seems slightly imperfect. Or alternatively, there's a nerve that connects your larynx to your brain. It's called the laryngeal nerve. Now, this is a very important nerve. If it gets damaged, that can be really bad for the organism. And so you'd think if you were building a creature from scratch to build it as perfectly as possible, to make it as well adapted for its environment as you can, you'd want to take the shortest path from the brain to the larynx so as to minimize the chance that it might get damaged and hurt the creature. But that's not what we see when we look at biology. As the laryngeal nerve goes down from your brain, goes through your sort of throat, wraps around your sort of heart, and then goes back up to connect to the larynx. So thereby increasing the chances that it could get damaged. This is true not just in humans, but also giraffes. Their laryngeal nerve goes all the way down that long neck and then all the way back up. It's an incredibly inefficient design. It is not a design that is perfectly adapted for the environment of the giraffe. And it is, if we attribute the imperfections in machines to imperfections in their designers, and we're relying on this analogy between machines and natural parts, well, the imperfections we see in these natural parts of the universe, the ways that they are imperfectly adapted to their environments, we ought to attribute those imperfections to imperfections in their designers as well. And so that would seem to undermine, say, well, why is there imperfection in nature? Because, well, if there is a God that created everything, well, God didn't know everything, or God wasn't all-powerful and couldn't avoid those mistakes. Another worry here is machines are often designed to do evil things because their designers are morally imperfect. So, for instance, people have created guns. They've created atomic bombs where their purpose was to cause pain and suffering, to kill. So, to do evil actions. Well, when we look at the sort of universe, we also see evil things occurring in the world that was created. And so if there's a designer, is that designer really morally perfect? So this hints at the problem of evil that we're going to start to look at next time. All right. A third objection here is more contemporary. It is, look, maybe, if we ignore all those things we just talked about, maybe Paley's argument provided some support for God during Paley's life. However, we are in a completely different situation now because we have a scientific explanation with lots of physical evidence for how the parts of nature can come to be arranged into adaptive systems by purely natural principles. We have Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So here's a nice, just quick sort of overview by Julian sort of Huxley. So the evolutionary process results immediately and automatically from the basic property of living matter, that of self-copying, but with occasional errors. Self-copying leads to multiplication and competition. The errors in self-copying are what we call mutations, and mutations inevitably confer different degrees of biological advantage or disadvantages on their possessors. The consequence will be differential reproduction down the generations. In other words, natural selection. All right, now, at this point, I want to point out that, so we have all this evidence for evolution. We have these natural explanation for how an undesigned, unguided process could lead to creatures that are well adapted to their environment. But with that alternative explanation for these teleological systems in nature, now the problem of imperfect design is even more worrisome than it was before. The hypothesis of a perfect designer seems to predict perfect design. But evolution predicts that we would see imperfect design in nature, because evolution must work from the materials it's been given. Design via evolution is like trying to build the best raft while you're already at sea. The idea is, look, if you're already at sea, you can't go get all the best materials for designing the perfect raft. And so if you got to sort of build it at sea, yeah, you might build something really great, but it's still just going to be the best that you could do with the materials you've been given. And your raft at that point is going to be far from ideal. It wouldn't be the perfect raft. It wouldn't be the raft you'd build if you could build it from scratch, sort of from any materials you wanted. Similarly, evolution has to build creatures from the materials it's been given. Thus, the fact that we see various inefficiencies in nature gives evidence in favor of evolution. Now, I mean, there's even more you could say here to spell out the detail, but I don't want to turn this into a biology lesson. I just want to give you enough information to so you can see the issues. All right, so someone might reply here that, look, maybe evolution is the tool that God uses to create teleological systems. Maybe there's some really good reason that God wants creatures to evolve rather than just create them sort of perfect from the get-go. And so God creates evolution so as to, it's sort of the hammer by which God chisels creatures into well-adapted, so to make them well-adapted to their environment. Now, this is a move you can make. You can try to argue that God creates evolution and then evolution creates these creatures. But I want to point out that this would abandon the argument from design, because this maneuver aims to show how it's possible for God to exist with evolution. That's very different than the view that design that we see in the world gives us positive evidence for thinking that God's existence is likely. At this point, the theist is sort of on defense. They're trying to defend their view from a criticism as opposed to actually providing positive support for their view. So at this point, design would still no longer provide evidence for theism. They would just be saying, well, look, the fact that we have design and evidence for evolution is still, it doesn't rule out the possibility of a God. But what we want is not just some proof that God is possible. The design argument was trying to give evidence that it's rational to believe in God. All right, so that's all for now. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.